Racism has a history, and the history is not that old. So for most of human history, it didn't exist. Someone had to create it, convince people of it, tell a story, then build structures and edifices to make it have real consequences. But we're not done. We can tell different stories. I'm a professor here at UC Berkeley and the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, and have 2 recent books out, The Power of Bridging and Belonging Without Othering.
Welcome to This Stakes Explained.
Thanks for having me.
You've linked the rise of authoritarianism to dominance-based identities, specifically whiteness in the West and in the U.S. How do you think about the Trump administration's executive orders around immigration and targeting immigrants in this context?
Well, authoritarianism is in direct contradiction to a liberal democracy. And we have one of the oldest democracies in the world. And this is really an attack on that. And it's not just an old democracy, it's a pluralistic democracy, not organized around religion, not organized around blood, but really around a civic democracy. Ethnic nationalism, and white nationalism is one expression of that, rejects that. It basically says that to belong, to be part of the political community, you have to be a particular ethnicity or a particular race or particular religion. And to effectuate that, an authoritarian leader, a leader who really doesn't trade in democracy and certainly doesn't trade in pluralism, comes to the helm. And those leaders are oftentimes demagogues. They don't care really about institutions, whether the institution is the Constitution or separation of powers. And they only really focused on a narrow group of people. And oftentimes they tell a story of grievance, how a dominant group oftentimes have been grieved by the non-dominant group. And we're seeing all of that play out.
Help us understand what's happening with the immigration executive orders, as well as attacks on transgender rights, the DEI programs, cultural institutions, educational institutions.
They all may seem dispersed and attacking different groups, but there's a through line in them that makes it pretty simple. One of the things that's oftentimes happened in authoritarian regimes is a sense of purity. There's this very narrow sense of who belongs. In this sense, oftentimes, ethnic nationalism, white nationalists, Christian, Protestant. And so anyone outside of that, whether it's Catholic, whether it's Hindu, whether it's gay, doesn't really belong. When we look at data suggesting that the country is not going to be a white majority in 2045, anxiety goes up in the country. The immigration is seen as polluting our country. And Trump made it clear. He said he's not against immigrants from Norway. So it's not immigrants per se, it's immigrants who don't fit a particular mold.
This would help explain the invitation to Afrikaners, for example.
Elon Musk is from South Africa. His grandfather was associated with some of these ideas. Elon Musk attacked Mackenzie Scott, who was formerly Jeff Bezos' wife. When they separated, divorced, she became one of the richest people in the world. She gave money to a number of groups, women's groups, pro-choice groups. He said she was destroying Western civilization. So what is his view of Western civilization? Well, clearly it's not where women have choice. He talked about empathy being a poison to the country. Now, this is one of the most powerful people selected by Trump, someone who's not just not empathetic, who's anti-empathetic.
I'm really happy you brought that up because there is an entire discourse on the right that's anti-empathy. Elon Musk has actually called it suicidal empathy. That was a phrase he used.
Right.
What kind of political or civil society can we have if that's the position people take?
Well, a lot of these people, and I teach this don't believe in equality. And it's been part of our struggle since we were a colony, but certainly since we became a country. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold certain truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And yet he had 600 people enslaved. And so how do you square that? And one of the ways that the court squared it was that black people were not people. So if you say, these people are created equal, but those enslaved beings over there are not people, which is very similar to South Africa, where South Africa had the majority of people not able to vote because they were not considered people. We thought that ideology had died out, but it's alive. Not well, but it is alive.
But it is alive, indeed. You know, you've written a lot about structural racism, and You've written a lot about the institutions through which these ideologies course and become kind of codified. And in particular, you've identified education as a site for creating what you call racialized outcomes. Can you explain what that means?
We've known for a long time that education plays a very important role in terms of making a nation and even making a race. Anthony Mark's book, Making Race and Making Nation, he looks at Brazil, the United States, and South Africa. And so how do you prepare people to be citizens? People aren't born citizens. Being a citizen means being able to take someone else's perspective, being able to walk in someone else's shoes. And one of the roles of education was to prepare people for that. Early education in the United States up until really the mid-50s was highly segregated. Again, if you say black people are not people and have no role other than the serving role, then you're not going to educate them. Finally, Brown v. Board of Education started to break that. And the court talked about maybe that was the most important thing that a state provided for its citizens was an education. And that to educate students where you basically say they're separate because of their race can inflict an injury on students. The South reacted very strongly. There's the Little Rock Nine, where literally Eisenhower had to call in federal troops to have 9 black kids go to a school with white kids. So education has always been contested. We've never really broke the back of that dual system. So Brown sort of pronounced it, but didn't really implement it. Today, most schools are still segregated by race and class. And that has implications in terms of who belongs, who gets the right to participate, who goes to college, who gets a good job.
Right. And if this is already the context, what then becomes the impact of shuttering the Department of Education, for example?
So there's a whole ideology that's hostile to the public, whether it's public housing, public transportation, public health, social security, public education. Right? If black blood destroys whiteness, do you want those students going to school with white children? And so one of the ways you do that, and you're seeing it right now, is you take apart those systems, those structures, those institutions that supported public education. So you actually go at the institutions whose job it is to bring people together, whose job it is to invest in people. And in that system, only those with resources and means can then really thrive, if anyone.
In your work, you focus on bridging communities. Can you explain, for people who are new to your work, what bridging means?
The concept has been around a long time, and it takes on different expressions. In the United States, it's popularized by Putnam in a book he wrote called Bowling Alone. But the idea is that we sort of don't really know each other. We live in separate neighborhoods. We go to separate places to worship. We go to separate schools. And we have ideas about each other, but not from lived experience, from ideas, from movies, from books, from propaganda. And this is really what the nature of prejudice is about. So bridging is saying, can we come together and really see each other as human beings? Can we listen to each other? Not to agree with each other, but just to acknowledge our shared humanity. We all know our own story. We all know our own suffering. We don't know the suffering and burden of other people. That's what bridging invites. When that happens, the other person becomes humanized. Again, it doesn't mean they're right or we agree with them, but they're a human being, which a lot of the arrangements we've been talking about earlier denies the humanity of some people.
So if we have folks being educated kind of in silos in some instances and developing ideas about others who may not live in their neighborhood or that don't go to their schools, for example, how do they even come to have these kinds of conversations if we see each other as so radically different?
I think empathy is not necessarily hard to achieve. I think in some ways it's the opposite. Is that we have to teach people to hate. We have to teach people to be racist. We have to teach people not to care. And the injury is not just to the target, the injury is also to us. We are part of each other. It's not just an idea. And so we have to work really hard to keep the lie alive that we're separate. And certainly they were separate by race and by ethnicity. And it's not to say we're all the same, but we're all expressions of something very powerful.
How would you respond to someone who says, well, it's nice to have people sit together and talk about their stories and get to know each other, but that's not going to change structures. It's not going to change institutions.
In the last few years, what people have found out is that stories may even be more powerful than structures, that what we believe call those structures into being. And so it's not either or, it's both and. Harari, who wrote *Sapien*, basically says when we learn to tell stories, when we learn to imagine, we can tell stories about things that we haven't seen that we can imagine. From Harari's perspective, Christianity is a story that 2.2 billion people adhere to in some way.
So by that logic, democracy is a story.
Democracy is a story. And how far can we go in certain? Imagination is not limited. Our ability to cooperate is because we can imagine. How far can we imagine? So we can't imagine a world where racism doesn't exist. Yet, racism has a history, and the history is not that old. So for most of human history, it didn't exist. Someone had to create it, convince people of it, tell a story, then build structures and edifices to make it have real consequences. But we're not done. We can tell different stories.